Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder if our brains are like busy traffic controllers, trying to manage too many things at once? And what happens when we ask them to juggle too much? Well, today we're diving into a fascinating study that explores just that, looking at how our brains handle understanding sentences. Especially when things don't quite add up logically and when we're trying to do something else at the same time. Think about it this way. Sometimes when you read or hear something, it sounds right grammatically, but your gut says, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense in the real world. How does your brain deal with that conflict? And does it matter if your brain is already busy? This research wanted to know if our brains can still figure out when a sentence is weird or illogical, even if we're trying to do something else that's distracting us. They were specifically interested in a part of our memory called the phonological loop. You can think of the phonological loop as your brain's scratchpad for sounds and words, helping you remember what you just heard or said so you can piece sentences together. Have you ever been on the phone and tried to remember a phone number while someone else is talking to you? That is your phonological loop working hard. So, the big question was, if we mess with this sound scratchpad, does it mess up how we understand confusing sentences? To figure this out, the researchers brought in some participants and had them listen to Japanese sentences. Some sentences were perfectly normal and made sense. Others were designed to be a bit odd, or as the scientists call it, implausible. This means the sentence might be grammatically correct, but the meaning goes against what we know about the world. For example, imagine hearing the baby held up her mother. Grammatically, it is fine, but it is not something we expect to happen in reality. Scroll Abstract Introduction Human Sentence Comprehension relies on limited cognitive rep, sources that support both syntactic processing and the integration of world knowledge. Scroll they used a clever trick called articulatory suppression. This is where participants had to do something else with their mouth and vocal cords while listening to the sentences. In this case, they were asked to whisper a nonsense syllable, like dabagada, over and over. This is like trying to sing a song in your head while listening to someone else. It keeps that phonological loop busy, making it harder to use it for understanding the sentences. Scroll Figure 1. Procedure for the experiment in the articulation condition. Participants were asked to whis. Perdalton bagada while listening to a sentence scroll. So they had two main conditions. One was a no task or control condition where people just listened to the sentences and then answered questions about them. The other was the articulation suppression condition where they whispered the nonsense syllables while listening and then answered questions. They were looking at two things: how accurate people were at understanding the sentences, and what their brains were doing using fMRI, which is like a special camera that shows us which parts of the brain are active. Scroll methods using functional magnetic resonance imaging. This study investigates comprehension accuracy and brain activity during comprehension of plausible and implausible Japanese sentences under a single task condition and a dual task condition involving concurrent articulation. Scroll now for the exciting part, the results. What did they find when they looked at how well people understood the sentences? Scroll Figure 2. Accuracy of each condition. Accuracy was lower in the articulation condition than in the no-task condition, and lower in the implausible condition than in the plausible condition. There is no interaction. Scroll first, just like you might expect when participants had to do the whispering task, their overall accuracy in understanding the sentences went down compared to when they just listened. So, being distracted definitely made it a bit harder to get things right. Also, as expected, sentences that were implausible, the ones that didn't make real-world sense, were harder to understand and people made more mistakes on them. This just confirms that our brains pay attention when something feels off. But here is the really interesting bit: they didn't find a significant interaction between the whispering task and the implausibility. What does that mean in simple terms? It means that the difficulty people had with implausible sentences was there, pretty much to the same extent, whether they were whispering or just listening quietly. The problem with the illogical sentences didn't get any worse or better, just because their phonological loop was busy. Scroll results. Whole brain analyses revealed lower comprehension accuracy and greater activation in regions, including the bilateral inferior frontal gyrus and the supplementary motor area for implausible than for plausible sentences. However, no significant interaction between plausibility and secondary task was found. Suggests that the plausibility effect was observed, regardless of whether participants performed concurrent articulation. Scroll this is a big deal. It suggests that the part of your brain that recognizes when something doesn't make sense in the real world, even if it is grammatically correct, might not rely as heavily on that specific sound-based memory scratchpad, the phonological loop. Even when that loop was occupied with whispering, the brain could still detect the conflict between the sentence's structure and our knowledge of how things work. The brain scans also told a story. They found, as we expected, that the whispering task made a lot of the brain light up, especially areas related to movement and speech production. That is just the brain doing its job for the secondary task. More importantly, they saw that implausible sentences, compared to plausible ones, activated certain areas more strongly. Scroll table 2 significantly activated brain regions of whole brain analysis. For each area, the coordinates XYZ of the activation peak in MNI space, peak t-value, and size of the activated cluster in number K of voxels are shown. W corrected P 0.05 with cluster. Level after the initial threshold P 0.001 with voxel. Level scroll these activated areas included parts of the inferior frontal gyrus, a region often linked to language processing and higher level thinking, and the supplementary motor area. This makes sense because figuring out that a sentence is strange requires some serious brain work. Now, to get a closer look, they focused on specific parts of the inferior frontal gyrus, calling them lift-tree and lift-gorb. They found that both of these areas were sensitive to the plausibility of the sentences. However, only lift-tree seemed to be more active when participants were doing the whispering task. Scroll figure 4. Regions of interest, ROI definition and parameter estimates in lift-tree and lift-gorb. ROI is used in the analysis, including the left inferior frontal gyrus pars triangularis lift-tree and pars orbitalis lift-gorb, shown in red. The graph shows mean parameter estimates extracted from each ROI for each experimental condition. Error bars indicate standard errors. Both regions showed greater activation for implausible than plausible sentences. However, only lift-tree exhib it had increased activation in the articulation condition relative to the notas condition, whereas no significant effect of the secondary task was observed in lift-gorb. No significant interaction between plausibility and secondary task was found in either region scroll. So what is the big takeaway here? This research suggests that our ability to notice when a sentence doesn't make sense, even if it is grammatically okay, is pretty robust. It doesn't crumble just because our sound-based memory scratchpad is busy. This hints that this kind of logic checking might use different brain resources than just holding on to sounds. It might involve deeper integration of language with our overall understanding of the world, possibly using a part of working memory called the episodic buffer, which is like a central hub for combining different kinds of information. Scroll discussion. These findings suggest that syntax plausibility conflict remains behaviorally and neurally detectable under articulatory suppression. Scroll the researchers also propose that different parts of the inferior frontal gyrus might have slightly different jobs. Lift-tree seems to be more responsive to the overall demands of a task, getting busier when the brain is juggling multiple things. Lift-gorb, on the other hand, might be more consistently involved in the core process of understanding sentences, regardless of how busy the rest of the brain is. Scroll these findings suggest that syntax plausibility integration may rely on a component of working memory other than the phonological loop. Scroll, there are a couple of important things to keep in mind about this study. The researchers mentioned that doing the whispering task, while good at tying up the phonological loop, also involves other things like speech motor control. So it's not a perfectly pure test of just the phonological loop. Future studies might try different kinds of distractions to really pinpoint what is going on. Also, they found that how much something called working memory capacity a person has didn't predict how well they did on the comprehension task, which was a bit of a surprise. Scroll limitations and future directions first. Caution is warranted regarding functional localization within the lift-tree because the functional role of lift-tree remains controversial. Scroll, but overall, this study gives us a really neat glimpse into how our brains handle the complex task of understanding language. It shows that our ability to detect when something illogical is happening in a sentence is a pretty strong mechanism, not easily disrupted by simple distractions. It's like our brains have a built-in does that makes sense checker that works even when other parts are a bit overloaded. This could have implications for understanding how we learn language, how people with language difficulties process information, and even how we can improve our own comprehension skills by understanding how our brains manage cognitive load. So next time you encounter a sentence that makes you pause and think, wait a minute, that is weird, remember that it is your amazing brain, likely using resources beyond just its sound buffer, working hard to make sense of it all. What do you think about these findings? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this dive into the mind, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more fascinating research, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration. Until then, stay curious.